Natchez, Mississippi. August, 1847. A city of contradictions. From its bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, Natchez glittered with wealth. Cotton was king, and nowhere was its throne more splendid than here. Mansions lined the streets, their parlors filled with imported furniture, their dining tables dressed in European china and crystal goblets that caught candlelight like fragments of fire. But beneath this elegance lay something darker. For every wealthy planter who counted his riches in bales of cotton, there were dozens living in bondage, men, women, and children whose labor fed the economy, whose cries echoed behind closed doors, and whose silence kept the machinery of wealth turning. It was within this world of contradiction that one of the most haunting stories of the American South unfolded. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of cotton. Nearly 50 enslaved men and women lived in its quarters, bound to its prosperity. At its head was Judge Cornelius Whitmore, stern, commanding, a man who ruled his court and his household with the same iron hand. His wife, Margaret, managed the home with what she called Christian firmness. To her, obedience was virtue, and discipline was love. On August 18th, the great house was full of voices. The judge's 62nd birthday had drawn his 4 grown children back home. They brought with them their spouses, grandchildren, and noise that filled the corridors. Servants hurried about, lighting candles, polishing silver, preparing for the feast. 12 adults would take their seats around the dining table that night. Smaller chairs had been drawn up for the children, eager to mimic the rituals of their elders. The table gleamed with fine china, silver cutlery, and crystal goblets. A celebration was underway. But before the next sunrise, the Whitmore mansion would be silent. At the heart of this story was Clara, the Whitmore's cook. 11 years earlier, she had stood on an auction block in New Orleans. 2 little girls clung to her skirts, her daughters, no more than toddlers. Within hours, they were gone, sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a place where children rarely survived long. Witnesses recalled her screams, her collapse on the floor of the market. But the crowd moved on. And when Clara rose again, she rose silent. They say she never saw her daughters again. On the Whitmore plantation, she became invisible. The perfect servant. Her hands prepared meals that drew praise across Adams County, yet her eyes stayed lowered, her voice hushed. Day after day, she stirred pots, kneaded dough, seasoned meats, all while fading into the background. But invisibility gave her power. Clara was not only hands in the kitchen, she was eyes and ears. When Dr. Hayes, the local physician, visited the family, Clara lingered nearby with a rag or broom. Over the years, Clara became a student of silence. Every stray word spoken in the Whitmore household was stored away, every detail about medicine and sickness catalogued in her memory. When Dr. Hayes discussed symptoms, she absorbed the knowledge as though he were her teacher. When the servants whispered of deaths on neighboring plantations, she listened for patterns. Even the Whitmore dogs became her unwilling experiments. Small doses slipped into scraps, each reaction observed and measured until she knew exactly how much was needed to sicken, to cripple, to kill. At the general store, she purchased rat poison without suspicion. Rat poison at the time was sold openly. A necessity for households plagued with vermin. Each packet she tucked away into a hollow gourd behind flour sacks in the kitchen, her private apothecary of revenge. Nothing was left to chance. She rehearsed in her mind how she would move, where she would stand, what she would carry when the moment came. She even practiced vanishing into the night, learning the swamp paths under moonlight so thoroughly that she could walk them blind. She memorized his words about symptoms, remedies, and dosages. Knowledge no one suspected she possessed. She was patient. She was careful. And in her patience, she became dangerous, deadly. That humid August evening, servants carried steaming platters to the dining hall. The aroma of roasted duck, rich with wine and herbs, mingled with the sweetness of magnolia blossoms drifting through open windows. The grandfather clock in the parlor struck 7. Each note lingered in the heavy air, sounding eerily similar to a funeral bell. Judge Whitmore raised his glass. His voice carried the weight of authority, even in celebration. To family, and to prosperity. The adults lifted their goblets, crystals shimmering in the candlelight. The children raised their cups of cider, giggling at the clink of glass. Conversation swelled. Cotton prices, marriages, inheritances, and gossip filled the air. Margaret scolded the children's manners, the judge boasted of his estate, as he always did, and of his cook, Clara, whose food he claimed was finer than any in Adams County was served. Clara stood in the doorway, hands folded neatly in her apron. Silent. Watching. On the table lay roasted duck beneath a rich reduction, vegetables creamed in butter, warm bread fresh from the oven. And in the kitchen, a birthday cake waited, frosted and sweet. But beneath the sauces and sugar lurked bitterness. A powder stirred carefully, undetectable in taste, fatal in dose. 6-year-old Emma wrinkled her nose and whispered to her grandmother. "These taste funny." Margaret frowned. "Nonsense. You are not leaving the table until your plate is clean." Clara's cooking was beyond reproach. Margaret quipped, "Clean your plate." None suspected. None imagined that every dish had been turned into a weapon, and with every bite taken, meant they only had moments left to live. At first, it was subtle. A flushed cheek. A slurred word. A spilled glass of wine. Then Emma clutched her stomach, trembling before vomiting onto the linen tablecloth. Her mother rushed to her, only to collapse to the floor herself. The judge staggered to his feet, his throat closing, his face purpling as he struggled to breathe. He clawed at the air before collapsing face first into his own birthday cake, foam bubbling at his lips. The dining room erupted in chaos. Chairs overturned, silverware clattered, crystals shattered on the floor. Voices cried out, "Poison! Fetch the doctor!" But no one came. Margaret Whitmore, despite the fire spreading through her organs, managed to drag herself to the silver bell used to summon servants. She rang it frantically, as the sound cut through the chaos like a scream in the night. But no one came. In the kitchen, 6 enslaved workers heard it perfectly. They looked at each other, an entire conversation passing in glances, then returned to washing dishes as if nothing had happened. One by one, the Whitmores convulsed, their voices fading into gurgles. Within the hour, the dining hall had fallen silent. And Clara? She was gone. The doorway she stood in as dinner was served, now stood empty. The enslaved workers of the household heard the screams. But none moved quickly. The footman folded his gloves before setting them aside. The housemaids finished their laundry. The stable boy stood frozen, watching Clara slip toward the river with a bundle in her arms. Years later, he would confess, "I could have run for the doctor. But I thought of my sister, sold when the judge found himself in need of quick money. I just stood there, and I watched." A young stable boy then, he found himself unable to react, to move or speak as he watched Clara walk away that night. Had his subconscious mind taken over at that very moment? Happy that the masters of the house, who caused them all so much emotional pain, were finally gone. Do you think the Whitmores had it coming? We are curious if you thought the family's demise was justified. Let us know in the comments below. It wasn't until years later, when the stable boy, now an adult, finally admitted that his failure to go for help was not malice. It was simply recognition. After all, for generations, silence had been their only weapon. That night, silence was complicity. By midnight, the grand hall resembled a battlefield. Wine stained the linens like blood. China lay shattered, goblets rolled across the floor. Bodies slumped in their finery, mouths still, eyes glazed. The once celebratory dining room was choked with the acrid stench of vomit and the unmistakable odors of bodies surrendering to death. Margaret's silver bell lay on the floor, unanswered. Candles flickered low, their flames trembling above the stillness. Outside, the Mississippi flowed on, indifferent, carrying secrets as it always had. Clara did not flee blindly. She moved with precision. Her bundle carried spare clothes, forged papers naming her Sarah Coleman, free woman, and $37 saved in secret over years. She slipped into the swamp paths she had studied by moonlight while gathering herbs. Crickets sang, frogs croaked, magnolia blossoms gleamed pale in the dark. Ahead lay the river, wide, dangerous, but filled with promise. Behind her, the Whitmore mansion lay silent. In the early morning hours after the deaths, there was a dilemma brewing. In the quarters, 47 enslaved people faced a terrible decision. Report the deaths and face interrogation or seize this unprecedented moment of freedom. Ruth, Clara's closest friend, was the first to act. She thought quickly on her feet, or was it pre-planned what she would do next? Ruth had been the Whitmores' head housemaid for 15 years, trusted with keys to every room except the judge's study. Now she found herself suddenly standing in that forbidden sanctuary, frantically rifling through the judge's papers with trembling hands. She located land deeds, bills of sale, contracts, including her own. She located paperwork listing her value at $800 like she was nothing more than livestock. Soon, Ruth heard the words, "Burn it all," said Samuel, the plantation's blacksmith. His voice barely above a whisper, as if they were still afraid the Whitmore family would overhear them. Samuel suggests they tell a story that bandits came in the night. But old Moses, another plantation slave, with his three-fingered hand resting on his cane, shook his gray head and said, "You think they'll believe bandits poisoned a family at dinner? They'll hang every last one of us before asking questions." A quiet debate continued while upstairs. Flies from the open windows had already discovered the early beginnings of decomposition. By 7 a.m., a field-hand slave named Jupiter had been chosen to ride to the neighboring Turner plantation with news of a terrible sickness that affected the Whitmore house. The story was discussed and agreed upon by the Whitmore enslaved servants. Jupiter would tell the story that the family had taken ill during dinner, and despite the servants' best efforts to help, all had succumbed to what appeared to be tainted food. By mid-morning, Sheriff William Donovan arrived at the Whitmore estate accompanied by the county coroner. What met them was a scene that looked chaotic on the surface but bore the marks of careful staging. Servants cried openly in the hallway, their wails rehearsed, while others bent to the grim work of scrubbing stains that would never fully vanish from the wooden floors. At the door stood Ruth, the head housemaid, her eyes swollen and red. Onion juice, not grief, had summoned those tears. "It happened so quickly, Sheriff," she sobbed, wringing her hands. One moment they were laughing at supper, the next, they were gone. With a trembling gesture, she pointed toward the dining room, where the table still bore the remains of the meal. Dr. Marcus Webb, the coroner, who arrived with the sheriff, was a methodical man, trained in Philadelphia before returning to the South. He moved among the bodies with a physician's precision, noting every detail: the cherry tint of the skin, the pinprick pupils, the foam crusted at the corners of their mouths. His conclusion came swiftly: arsenic. And in such quantity, he remarked, that it could not have been a careless accident. Whoever had mixed it in had used enough to require deliberate planning. Donovan turned to the servants. "Who prepared the food?" he demanded, though in his heart he already knew the answer. "We all did," Ruth answered, her words a fragile half-truth. "Clara, she made the sauces before she left. But I finished them. Samuel carved the duck. Letty cooked the vegetables. If the food was poisoned, then each of us touched it. It was a brilliant defense. Spread the blame so wide, so thin, that no single hand could be made to carry it." There was no mention of Clara, who as far as anyone knew had been sold to a plantation in Georgia 2 weeks prior. Documents found from the Adams County Courthouse records, August 19, 1847, witness statements appeared to claim that cook Clara had been transferred to the Belmont estate on August 5, bill of sale produced by surviving household staff. Investigations were ongoing. Unknown to the sheriff at the time, that bill of sale in reality was Ruth's masterwork, forged with ink, mixed fresh that morning, aged with coffee grounds and smoke, bearing a signature she would practice copying over 100 times till she got it almost perfect. Clara had taught her to read and write in secret by candlelight. The punishment had they gotten caught learning how to write, was a lash for each letter learned. Donovan questioned the servants. Ruth, the housemaid, wept convincingly, her tears coaxed by onion juice. Had Clara taught her this technique? It makes you wonder how complicit all the slaves were in what had occurred. How much did they actually know was going to happen? Ruth swore Clara had been sold to a Georgia plantation weeks earlier. She then produced that bill of sale. But the ink was fresh, the signature shaky. It wasn't long before a telegram confirmed Donovan's suspicion. No such plantation existed. Clara had not been sold. She had escaped. In Clara's cabin, Sheriff Webb discovered a small journal-type book, written in a crude code. It was Clara's. By lamplight, he eventually broke the cipher. What he found was beyond chilling. There were formulas, symptoms, and dosages. Not recipes for food, but for death. And then, a list of names. Prominent families. Dates beside each. Henderson, Beauregard, Lancaster. What did this mean? It just couldn't be. Could Clara have done this before? The enslaved people Clara left behind at the Whitmore plantation would surely face further questions, investigations, and could risk consequences. Life-threatening consequences. Would the sheriff think they all were involved in the demise of 12 people? The question then has to be asked. What happens to the enslaved, the plantation itself, when every white person on the property dies in a single night? And the list of the prominent families? All had suffered strange deaths in recent years. A patriarch dead at dinner. Sons poisoned by whiskey. A mother and daughter taken by summer fever. The truth emerged. Clara had not killed once. For 5 years, she had moved between households, quiet, invisible, trusted, until she struck. The Whitmores were her finale. But they were not her first. The sheriff continued his search. The kitchen was next, but found spotless. Every pan scoured, every surface polished. If poison had been prepared there, no trace remained. The pantry revealed nothing unusual, only flour, herbs, and the ordinary stores of a large household. Even the packet of rat poison tucked behind the flour sacks matched the amount listed on its purchase slip from months before. Clara thought of everything in every detail. Every possible way of getting caught, of a slip-up, she eliminated in advance, and it appears with the help of the other servants. But Dr. Webb's sharp eyes caught a detail that was overlooked. On the kitchen floor lay a single magnolia petal, carried in on someone's shoe. Magnolia trees grew only near the river path, far from the kitchen door. It was clear, someone had been walking where these petals would be found at some point during the night. Someone who didn't belong out at that time of night. Donovan then ordered a search of the grounds. Cabins, stables, outbuildings, all were combed through. Yet nothing emerged except the expected poverty of enslaved quarters, husk mattresses, patched clothing, a few coins hidden away. What they did not find was more revealing. There were no letters, no scraps of paper, no sign of the secret lessons Clara had clearly been giving for years, teaching others to read by candlelight with verses from a borrowed Bible. Those materials had already been destroyed. Burned in the small hours of the morning, their ashes scattered in the garden soil. Clara had made certain of it before she vanished into the night. The search was on for Clara and spread across Mississippi. Posters were nailed to courthouse doors. Rewards were raised from $2,000 to $5,000, more than many men earned in a lifetime at that time. Bounty hunters joined the chase. Dogs tracked her scent. Riders scoured the roads and riverbanks. But Clara had planned for this. She disguised herself, changed her gait, altered her speech. She wore gloves to hide the noticeable scar she had on her hand. She even used padding to confuse her figure. Some said she had to have drowned. Others whispered she reached Canada, reuniting with her daughters. The truth was never certain. But one thing was, Clara had already succeeded. One woman's grief had silenced 12 seats forever. History shows Clara was riding a lumber wagon driven by a free black man named Josiah, part of the Underground Railroad network that operated like whispered prayers through the Deep South. It is said that she made it to the Louisiana border, her forged papers held up under cursory inspection. The wagon she rode carried hidden compartments with 3 other runaways. But Clara rode out in the open, using her new identity, Sarah Coleman, a seamstress heading to visit her family in Baton Rouge. Back at the Whitmore plantation, however, the investigation intensified. A judge from Jackson soon arrived to oversee the legal complexities now facing the Whitmore plantation. With no white heirs present, and all direct family found dead, the estate's ownership fell into question. Ruth, her friend, went so far in attempting to throw off the sheriff, and produce letters forged over the previous 2 weeks. The letters indicated that the Belmont family treats her well, Ruth said, and said she misses her friends here, but accepts God's will. Dr. Webb performed autopsies confirming what he suspected: massive arsenic poisoning in every victim. The amount suggested deliberate murder, not accidental contamination. But with the supposed perpetrator sold to Georgia, and no witnesses willing to break ranks, the investigation stalled. After the autopsies were performed, the Whitmore bodies were prepared for burial. The slaves gathered in their quarters for prayer. Their glances at one another spoke volumes. They'd survived the first day of questioning. But there was more to come. The hardest test would be maintaining their story as the investigation deepened. Monetary rewards were offered, as pressure mounted to give up Clara. But no one wavered. Old Moses led a prayer. His 3-fingered hand raised to heaven as he spoke, "Lord, we pray for the souls of the departed. May they find the peace in death that they denied others in life. Amen." The plantation continued to run as it had prior to that gruesome night. Lawyers struggled to sort out who would own them next. But first, they had to survive the next wave of investigation. It wasn't long before Sheriff Donovan had just received word that no Belmont plantation existed in Georgia, where Clara had supposedly been sold to. Sheriff Donovan's became angry, as his boots struck the Whitmore kitchen floor, attempting to instill fear in the Whitmore servants as he waved the telegram from Georgia. "There is no Belmont plantation. Never has been. You've all have been lying to me." But no one faltered. No one cracked, and they all kept up their stories. While the sheriff continued to investigate, Clara continued her escape through the hidden network of the Underground Railroad, as she passed from safe house to safe house. Ministers, wagon drivers, and boarding house keepers risked everything to move her northward. Soon, Sarah found herself sitting in the colored section of a steamboat heading up the Mississippi River. Luck was on Clara, now Sarah's side for the meantime. The ticket collector had barely glanced at her papers, distracted by a white woman who made a bit of a scene, complaining about her cabin. Clara kept her head down, fingers wrapped around a rosary she'd never used before, playing the part of a devout freed woman as she headed to Memphis for church work. Then, from the New Orleans Daily Picayune, August 21, 1847. Read, 12 dead in Adams County. Entire plantation family poisoned. Negro cook suspected. Now going by Sarah, she continued on to Baton Rouge. In Memphis, she took the role of just a traveler. In Cincinnati, whispers claimed she worked under yet another name in a boarding house. And always, and through each town she hit, she asked the same question: had anyone seen 2 young women, named Grace and Patience? Back in Natchez, Ruth made a calculated decision. She told the sheriff that Clara had been acting strange since her daughters were sold. That she was never the same. This time, not an act, nor the effects of onions, Ruth began allowing tears to well up, real tears, remembering those girls that had been ripped from Clara's side. Ruth shared that Clara had a cousin in Georgia who could get her work. "We were afraid of what she might do. We all lived in fear." Ruth attempted to throw the sheriff off the track while convincing him the plantation staff was not involved. The news of what had happened in Natchez at the plantation spread to other plantation owners. Mississippi Society plantation owners and in nearby states were asking how many other cooks were planning similar revenge. Soon, plantation owners dismissed cooks, or forced servants to taste food before serving it. Some families dismissed their entire household staffs, preferring to cook for themselves rather than risk poisoning. Kitchens were locked up at night, and for the first time, slave owners lived in fear of retaliation. In parlors and pulpits, Clara was spoken of like a phantom, the cook who turned supper into slaughter. And yet, among the enslaved, her name carried another meaning. Clara was the whisper of possibility. A reminder that even the seemingly powerless could strike a blow that shook the foundation of a society built on cruelty. Sheriff Donovan continued constantly to grill the staff for 2 weeks. The sheriff studied each face, looking for the telltale signs of deception. But these were people who'd spent their entire lives hiding thoughts, swallowing words, surviving by becoming invisible. They gave him absolutely nothing. A manhunt reaching over 100 miles grew each day. Wanted, a Negro woman approximately 30 years of age, 5 foot, 5 inches. This description could have fit many African women at the time. However, the small scar on left hand from kitchen burn would be a dead giveaway. So, they thought. But Clara had anticipated this. Before leaving, she'd used lye to lighten her skin just enough to confuse descriptions, styled her hair differently, and padded her clothes to appear heavier. The scar on her hand was hidden under gloves she'd stolen from Margaret Whitmore's drawer. Fine kid leather that marked her as a woman of means rather than a runaway cook. Meanwhile, the legal vultures had descended on the Whitmore estate. Distant cousins emerged from over 3 states away, claiming inheritance rights. Lawyers arrived in carriages, calculating the value of land, cotton, and human property with equal dispassion. Distant cousins, each with their hands out, were there to see what all they could get. The 47 enslaved people found themselves being appraised like furniture while their fate hung in bureaucratic limbo. As Clara, Sarah, continued to flee, on her travels she listened to white passengers discuss the murders with horrified fascination. A woman dressed in silk complained that she could no longer trust her cook of 20 years. While others suggested that all household slaves should be chained up at night. A minister proclaimed it proof that the African race was incapable of Christian mercy. White wealthy people in society were in a panic. Clara also prepared in case she was ever apprehended. She held close the vial of poison still hidden on her body. One final dose in case of capture. She'd rather die free than live enslaved. Soon, the manhunt had expanded across state lines. The reward increased to $2,000, a fortune back in the 1800s. Professional slave catchers joined the search in an effort to bring Clara to justice. In those days, no one would have imagined that a woman, least of all an enslaved woman, could outwit an entire county. Society dismissed them as voiceless, powerless, incapable of cunning. Yet Clara defied every expectation. Her escape was not the act of chance, but the result of a mind that had been quietly planning, calculating, and preparing for years. Hounds were set on her trail, trained with scraps of clothing taken from her cabin. But Ruth, ever loyal, had spoiled the scent with pepper and turpentine, confusing even the best trained noses. Still, Clara's genius lay not only in misdirection, but in connection. The Underground Railroad was ready to help Clara, now going by the name Sarah, on her journey to freedom, away from the bloodhounds and men who were searching for her. She was taken in by strangers who asked no questions and demanded no payment, only silence and trust. A minister in Baton Rouge, a shopkeeper in Memphis, a farmer outside Nashville, all risked their lives for a woman they'd never met, bound together by a single belief, that freedom was worth any danger. Sheriff Donovan continued in his search. Donovan believed he had finally uncovered the thread that could unravel Clara's trail. For weeks, her movements had seemed unpredictable, a ghost darting from one place to the next. But now, with maps spread across his desk, a pattern began to take shape. 4 red marks cut across the paper, each representing a household struck by sudden tragedy. Drawn together, the line pointed northeast, steady, deliberate. "She isn't wandering aimlessly," Donovan murmured. "She's heading somewhere." The realization struck him in the early hours of the morning, the courthouse dim except for the flicker of lamplight. Smoke from his pipe hung thick in the room, while outside, September rain battered the roof like the pounding of a judge's gavel. Dr. Marcus Webb, the county coroner, leaned over the maps, his physician's mind catching what Donovan had missed. "It's not only the geography," he said, tracing the marks with his finger. "Look at the families. Henderson, the Bogards, the Lancasters, and finally, the Whitmores. He opened a yellowed ledger, its pages fragile with age. These households aren't random. They're tied together by marriage and bloodlines. Then came the evidence that shattered doubt. Among Judge Whitmore's papers, a water-stained bill of sale from 1836 emerged. One young woman named Clara, age 19, and two little girls, ages 3 and 5, sold from Henderson Plantation and scattered at the New Orleans slave markets. Donovan's hand trembled as he whispered, "My God. She's been hunting the very families who tore her children from her." While the men in Mississippi pieced together her motives, Clara, traveling under the name Sarah Coleman, was long gone. Sat quietly in a small church outside Cincinnati. She listened as a sermon told of Moses leading his people from bondage, the voices of the congregation rising in harmonies that carried centuries of sorrow and hope. She clutched a rosary, at first only a prop in her disguise, but one she had begun to keep close. After the service, the minister's wife approached her kindly. "Sister Sarah, you seem burdened." Clara, always careful with her words, wove her truth into a cloak of half-fiction. "I am searching for my daughters. They were taken from me years ago. I heard they might have gone north." "What were their names?" the woman asked softly. Clara's voice broke as she whispered them, names that tasted of prayer and grief, patience, and grace. What she did not confess was how tirelessly she had tracked their paths. She had bribed for scraps of information, pressed for details from anyone who might know, traced ledgers like a bloodhound. Grace had once belonged to the Lancasters, patience had been sold to the Bogarts. Both were passed along again, but not before Clara made sure their first owners paid dearly. Back in Mississippi, the atmosphere grew fevered. Plantation owners demanded swift action, their fears no longer confined to whispers. The governor himself declared Clara a menace to the stability of the South, and the reward for her capture leapt to $5,000, a fortune in its time. At the Whitmore estate, a new overseer, Patterson, imposed his cruelty with methodical precision. Each day the enslaved community was interrogated. Food withheld. Families torn apart. Children separated from parents until someone broke. Their silence, however, was a fortress, a unity stronger than chains. Only old Moses, frail and starving, finally muttered in his sleep about the teaching tree. Patterson seized upon it. Forced awake, Moses confessed through trembling lips that Clara had secretly taught letters beneath a great oak, saying that knowledge was power. The admission sent tremors through Mississippi society. A literate woman, teaching others, calculating dosages, forging documents, the notion was terrifying to those who depended on ignorance as control. Orders went out: check every enslaved person for signs of literacy, punish or sell those who could read. But Moses had given them something deliberately useless. Clara had prepared for this. The tree had already been burned, the evidence scattered. Give them truths that lead nowhere, she had told her people. Make them chase shadows. Meanwhile, Donovan pressed his advantage. If Clara was following the trail of her daughters, then her path was predictable: Tennessee into Ohio, perhaps even Canada. He sent telegrams ahead, warning cities to watch for her. But Clara, ever resourceful, was already adjusting her disguise. She became invisible in a different way, just another freed woman struggling to survive. Yet survival alone was not her goal. In quiet moments she held a fragment of a letter she had intercepted, describing two young women who had established a school for black children in Ontario. Their names had been changed, but the descriptions were unmistakable, one with hands skilled like her own, the other with a voice that could stir angels to tears. Patience and grace. These memories, a crooked little finger, a birthmark behind a small ear, lived within her as if carved into her very bones. Each whispered rumor, each letter, pushed her forward. But her invisibility had one fatal flaw. Back in Mississippi, Dr. Webb examined her coded journal again and again until he saw it, a peculiar flourish, the curl of her letter, G. He had seen the same stroke in forged bills of sale, in kitchen inventories, even in laundry lists. She can change her face, her voice, her clothes, he told Donovan, but not her handwriting. The order went out: search every church, every boarding house, every workplace. Look for the writing. Follow the trail of ink as much as footsteps. And so, as Clara carried on, running for her life, hunting for her daughters, the noose of suspicion tightened. The hunt pressed north, fueled not only by blood and vengeance, but by the belief that she had outwitted them all. Some claimed she drowned. Others believed she reached Canada, where two schoolteachers named Grace and Patience, her daughters' names, taught children to read. The story doesn't end here. Years later, something interesting happened. It was a cold evening in 1882 when a young woman appeared at the Chicago boarding house, asking for work. Her movements were precise, her eyes sharp with quiet awareness. She introduced herself as Clara Freeman, where she met an elderly woman named Martha. For Martha, who had lived decades under borrowed names, the moment was like being struck by lightning. The name alone was enough to still her breath, but she betrayed nothing on her face. "My mother named me after someone she revered," the young woman explained softly. "A woman who chose freedom over safety, all out of love for her daughters that were taken from her." This Clara actually turned out to be the daughter of Patience, carrying her grandmother's name forward into another generation. She had come north to pursue medicine, not through universities that barred women of her color, but by apprenticeships, by stolen hours with borrowed books, and by sheer force of will. Martha took her in. Was this fate? A coincidence? She taught her not only to cook, but to measure life through the language of ingredients. To understand that recipes could be both nourishment and formula, that the same herb could heal or harm depending on the hand that used it. She trained her to read appetites as carefully as faces, to carry knowledge quietly, masked behind humility. One evening, as the lessons grew more dangerous, the granddaughter she never expected to know asked, "Why teach me this? Why show me things that can end a life as well as save one?" Martha's answer echoed across the decades, back to a long-ago oak tree. Because knowledge is power. And in the right hands, power can change the world. 3 years later, in 1885, the old woman passed away. The record said it was in her sleep, peaceful, natural. But Clara Freeman discovered otherwise, a carefully measured final dose, chosen and timed by Martha herself. Even death, she insisted, was not to be endured, it was to be decided. At her funeral, an unexpected mourner appeared. An elderly white woman in fine black clothing, her face hidden by a veil. She placed a single magnolia blossom on the coffin and left without a word. Whispers later revealed her to be Emma Whitmore, yes, the youngest grandchild from that fateful supper, the child who first complained of the strange taste in her vegetables. You see, it turned out that Emma had not died that night after all. Clara's revenge had been exact, the adults received death, but the children were given something else, a potion that imitated death without claiming it. Emma had been smuggled away in a coffin, raised in secret by abolitionists. She lived her life knowing she owed it to the cook who had ended her family, and spared her. We ask our viewers, how do you look at Clara now, knowing that she had not taken the lives of the children? Do you blame her for what she did, and what drove her to it? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel because you won't want to miss our next video. As we close, we discovered that the boarding house had thrived into the new century, carried on by Clara Freeman and others trained in Martha's ways. They served meals seasoned with wonderful herbs, each dish flavored with survival and memory. It became more than a place to eat, it was a place to learn, to inherit the knowledge of how to endure in a world that had long conspired against them. Yet even after Martha was gone, stories lingered. In Chicago, neighbors claimed that on certain summer nights, when the air was thick and the wind carried strange currents, a scent would drift from kitchens where no pot was on the stove. A mingling of magnolia and metal, of sweetness and something acrid. The smell of choices made in the dark, of vengeance plated with care. When the boarding house was demolished in 1923, a journal was found hidden within its walls. Its last entry bore no instructions for poison, no recipes, no lists, only 4 words written in a hand that curled its letters unmistakably. My daughters are free. Clara had always known that some chains break only when someone is willing to become the monster others already believe them to be. She had lived by that truth, and she had died by it. Her legacy did not survive in court records or polished histories. It lived instead in the kitchens where women stirred pots with deliberate hands, in the quiet strength of survival, in the unspoken belief that rage and love together could change the flavor of the world. The poison, in truth, had never only been in the food. It was in the system itself, in the cruelty that made such meals possible. Even now, in some corners of the South, people still whisper of the Whitmore supper. 12 dead around a birthday table. A cook who disappeared like smoke. And justice that was never found, or perhaps, was served too well. Whether she died in the river or lived under another name, Clara's story lingered. A story of grief transformed into vengeance. A story of silence turned into power. So, I ask you, was Clara a villain, a mother-turned-murderer? Or was she a woman who had nothing left to lose, who turned the tools of her bondage into her only weapon out of desperation to find her children? Her story may never have a clear ending. But one truth remains. In Natchez, on an August night in 1847, 12 seats were silenced forever. If this story has drawn you in, take a moment to like this video, share it with others who love hidden history, and subscribe to Facts Intrigue. Your support helps us uncover the stories that history tried to bury. Because history is not always written in books. Sometimes it is whispered in kitchens, hidden in journals, or carried by rivers that never give up their secrets.